Good, good morning. Good morning, all. I think we'll go ahead and get started with reminders and announcements as folks continue to filter in. As a reminder, our speaker next week will be Abby Fry, who will be delivering one of her wonderful talks on pharmacy hot topics. Today, you're joining for a very special lectureship, our 2019 Donald E. Olsen Memorial Lectureship. This was established by Dr. Olsen's wife and children to acknowledge his legacy here at St. Vincent's, where he was leader of the Department of Medicine for 41 years. He began his career at the Portland Clinic in 1955 and was among the first pulmonologists here in the region. He was Professor Emeritus of Critical Care and Pulmonology at OHSU, as well as founder of our Oregon chapter of ACP. Dr. Olsen's dedication to medical education on every level is truly an example for all of us. And I have a quote here from one of his own colleagues. Dr. Olsen had this wonderful humility and sincerity and continuous quest for knowledge that immediately bonded him with his patients. And it is in his honor that I am delighted to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Quinn Capers. He is Associate Professor of Medicine in the Division of Cardiology, as well as Director of the Interventional Cardiology Fellowship Program at The Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center. Dr. Capers earned his medical degree from The Ohio State University and went on to do his residency in internal medicine, as well as fellowship in cardiovascular disease and interventional cardiology at Emory University. He introduced the transradial artery technique of coronary stenting to Ohio State and has extensively studied its improved safety. His clinical excellence has been recognized by physicians and patients alike, and his peers have named him among America's best doctors annually for the past 10 years. More recently, Dr. Capers has turned much of his energy toward transformative leadership in academic medicine in the areas of medical school admissions, particularly looking at racial healthcare disparities and diversity enhancement. Prior to 2007, Ohio State had never trained a cardiovascular medicine fellow who was of African American descent. And Dr. Capers led a transformative turnaround at the institution, resulting in some classes of 25% African American compared to a 4% national average. He has served as the Associate Dean for Admissions in the College of Medicine at Ohio State since 2009, where he's also seen tremendous achievements in diversity. He's the primary author on the first study to document the presence and extent of unconscious racial bias in medical school admissions. And Dr. Capers has moderated over 100 implicit bias mitigation workshops, training over 1,000 physicians and healthcare workers. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Capers here today.
Thank you so very much for that very, very warm welcome. It's really a pleasure to be here. My first time in the Great Pacific Northwest, and it's beautiful. I understand there was supposed to be some snow, and since the word got out that I was coming, the snow held up. I appreciate that. Thank you so very much for the invitation to give the Olsen Lecture. It is truly an honor. And this talk today is timely, as one of your colleagues was just showing me this New York Times article that just came out about implicit bias in healthcare. Let me just say, I like to start with just this little preamble. Everything we talk about is not going to be pleasant. So I'm going to talk about some things that are maybe downright unpleasant, but the focus is how we all want to do the right thing, how we all want to treat everybody fairly. And we're all good people, and we all want to do that, but sometimes our unconscious mind can actually hijack our good intentions. And so it's important, we think, to do this deep dive into the unconscious so that we can really then be more successful at what we all want to do. I have no disclosures, but I like to start this way. So you're looking here at two doctors treating patients. They're doing what you and I do every day. So they get up in the morning, driving into work, we're talking about how today we are going to help people. That's what we do. Physicians, we're humanitarians. But all too often, two patients with the same diagnosis, symptoms, history, and objective findings are treated differently. Often in this country, in this scenario, the white patient is likely to receive a higher quality of patient-centered care. Now, if you were to say that to these doctors, if you were to say, gee, doctor, are you aware you're treating your white and black patients differently? Or you're treating your male and female patients differently? Or you're treating your elderly patients and your middle-aged patients differently? You'd have a fight on your hands. I mean, you better be ready to stand there and debate for the next 24 hours. Why? Because that's not who they want to be, and that's not who they see themselves being. But I'll show you some data that this happens all too often. A few definitions: implicit bias, a positive or negative attitude towards a person, thing, or group that operates outside of our awareness, outside of our conscious control. Of course, contrasted to explicit bias. You know what you like and what you don't like, so those are our explicit biases. I'm going to talk about this test, the implicit association test, which is one computer-based test to tell us what are our unconscious associations or unconscious preferences, or another word would be unconscious biases. Can I say by a show of hands, how many of you have taken one or more of these implicit association tests? Okay, good. It's an interesting exercise in self-awareness, we'll say that. So there's a black-white IAT, and in fact, if you go to the website, projectimplicit.org, to take one of these implicit association tests, you'll see there's a whole menu. A whole menu of them. You can take one to see if you have a bias against the elderly, against people who are obese, against people with dark skin, with light skin, people who have physical disabilities. There's a whole menu of these tests you can take. The black-white IAT is one of the most widely used tests. This one has one particular result. It's got several results, but we're going to talk about one particular result. There's a result called implicit white race preference. What does that mean? Today's New York Times article talked a bit about this. Implicit white race preference. If I take this test and it shows I have implicit white race preference, what that means is that when I see a white face, my unconscious mind automatically associates it with good things, good, happy things, good, happy thoughts. And when I see a black person's face, my unconscious mind automatically associates that with bad things like fear, danger, violence, misery, trouble. So that's called implicit white race preference, which could be completely counter to how you feel consciously. Well, we all have implicit biases. It is simply a part of being human. It's a normal response of the brain, and it's about pattern recognition. Our unconscious brain is really trying to do us a favor. It's trying to do us a solid. It's trying to help us out. Neuroscientists tell us that your brain is bombarded by 11 million stimuli a day. No way you could sit and contemplate all of those. So the vast majority of those stimuli you consciously ignore, and you're really only paying attention to what is relevant to what you're doing right now. But your unconscious mind is always recording. It's always recording. And so it then becomes a matter of pattern recognition. If every time, simplest example I can think of, if every time from childhood to now I've seen a tiger, whether it was in a comic book or in a movie or in real life on safari, if every time I've seen a tiger it's devouring something, my unconscious brain will say, tiger, bad, tiger, dangerous, so that if there are two exits here and there's a tiger sitting at one, my conscious mind doesn't say, that might be a friendly animal. My unconscious mind says, get away. Okay, so it's pattern recognition over the years, these stimuli that we've seen. We can test for it. The IAT, by the way, is not the only test. There are other tests. But these implicit biases, these unconscious associations have been associated with discriminatory behaviors in the education system, in the criminal justice system, and in the healthcare system. Here's one of the most important slides I can show you today, and that is that implicit white race preference is not the same thing as racism. The difference has everything to do with intention and control, awareness. So an example of racism would be if I were to say, I don't like to be around black males because they're dangerous. Well, I'm attributing a negative characteristic to a group based on their race. That's racism. But if I feel that way, it's not a secret to me that I feel that way. I'm aware that I feel that way. So that's not an implicit bias at all. That's an explicit bias. Racism is an explicit bias. Sexism is an explicit bias. But the implicit bias correlate of that would be if my unconscious mind, unbeknownst to me, now I don't know my unconscious mind is doing this, my unconscious mind automatically associates a black male face with danger. That may be completely counter to how I feel consciously. Consciously, I may be the most egalitarian man on the planet. But if my unconscious mind is making that association, black male face, danger, then that actually could influence how I treat people. So we've got to take the guilt out of the results of these tests. We've got to take the guilt out of implicit bias. In fact, there's no shame in having implicit bias. What I like to say, the shame is having implicit biases and not knowing what they are, not doing an examination so that you can know what they are. Because the good news, ladies and gentlemen, is that, as I like to say, in a wrestling match between your conscious mind and your unconscious mind, your conscious mind will win every time. That's not even a fair fight. We can very easily override our implicit biases. It takes effort and it takes awareness, but it can be done. This is what I was just saying. Racism is conscious and implicit racial bias is unconscious. So again, stimuli, 11 million a day. We're going through our lives. The vast majority of them we ignore, but our unconscious mind is recording. And those recordings, I like to say your unconscious mind is you with a pen and a notepad taking notes. Those notes over the years then become the foundations for these pattern recognition, these biases, these preferences. In a little more detail, so we all remember from early science classes, Pavlov's experiments with the dogs. You ring the bell and feed the dog at the same time. After doing that hundreds, maybe thousands of times, the sound of the bell makes the dog's mouth water. That's because in that dog's mind, bell ringing and mealtime have become fused, have become associated. So you can say that's an association or a preference or a bias. So the same thing happens to us. We're animals too. Now be honest, how many of you, when you see this symbol, can smell, you can smell roasting coffee? Am I the only one? Am I the only one? And that's because so very often when I see this symbol, I'm standing somewhere that I smell coffee. So in my unconscious brain can actually say that they're the same, but clearly they're not the same. Well, that's an example of a harmless unconscious association or preference, but they can be harmful as well. If, for instance, every time you see this, or very often when you see this, it's accompanied by this, your unconscious brain can tell you that they are the same. You may not feel that way consciously, but if this is the association that your unconscious brain is making, then when you're in the elevator and a young black male with a hoodie on gets in the elevator with you, then it might influence how you behave. So let's talk about some of these stimuli that we all are exposed to all of our lives, most of which we ignore. Here are some photographs that were sent out on the Associated Press back during Hurricane Katrina, when people trapped in their homes, starving, were waiting weeks for the government to come rescue them. On the same day, August 30th, these photographs of people getting food so that they and their families wouldn't starve to death were sent out with the accompanying captions. The one up top says, a young man walks through chest-deep floodwater after looting a grocery store. The one at the bottom says, 2 residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda. So think about those words, looting and finding. And what's the difference? And again, this may not be something that you pay direct attention to. You might just skim through the article and it just goes into the back of your mind. But remember, your unconscious mind is you taking notes. So here your unconscious mind might say, okay, I get it. So white people find and black people loot. It's an unconscious association. Let me show you something similar with a video, and I hope this video will play. Oh, before the video, let me show you this. So at Ohio State, we get these safety alerts from the OSU Police Department. It seems to me like every month there's a safety alert. So it'll tell you, be careful, something happened today, and here's something that happened. I've been at Ohio State 11 years. There is one of those alerts, it seems to me, almost every month. Somebody's wallet got stolen, somebody got mugged. In 11 years, this is the only time I've seen a photograph with that alert. Usually it's just an email. And usually they just describe the person but no photo. This photo was sent out, and I've actually blocked this young man's eyes. So what happened here is that somebody in the dorms was stealing cash, credit cards, electronics, etc. And they attached this photo with the instructions of, if you see somebody that looks like this, call the police. Now, I'm not here to argue this person's guilt or innocence. He was a suspect. I don't know why he was a suspect. But if I took the bar off the eyes and I were to ask you the question, how many of you know somebody that looks like this? Because what he looks like is a college student with a hat on. I bet you, a lot of you, if you think about it, you would know somebody who looks like this. Well, then you better call the police. So it's just another example of making that connection: blackmail, crime, blackmail, violence. And you might not pay this much attention, but this is the power of the images that are around us.
Meantime, 2 teenagers are wounded on the city's south side. It happened at East 74.
If I can turn this up a bit. That seemed a little quiet. So I'm showing you here a video clip that played at a local news station in Chicago. Unfortunately, we all know what's happening in Chicago. It's become kind of the murder capital of the world. Gun violence. Often, not always, but often, it is a black person shooting and killing a black person. So there's been another shooting here, and I want you to pay attention to this video. They interview the bystanders. Now, there's a 4-year-old boy they're going to interview, so I'm going to ask you 2 questions. I'm going to make 2 assignments. One, what does the little boy say? I'm going to ask you that later. Second, when they go back to the news desk, what do you hear the anchor say? Okay, so listen closely, please.
Is an 18-year-old man and 16-year-old girl were hit while standing on the sidewalk. Male's in good condition while the girl's expecting to recover. And kids on the street as young as 4 were there to see it all unfold and had a disturbing reaction.
No, I'm not scared of nothing.
When you get older, you gonna stay away from all these guns?
No.
No?
No.
What do you want to do when you get older?
I'm gonna have me a gun.
Because I live right here and I don't want none of my family members to get shot.
That is very scary indeed. So far, no suspects are in custody.
Okay, time for your first quiz of the day. So what did you hear the little boy say? What did the little boy say? I'm going to get me a gun. Did he say that? Did he say that kind of shy and bashful? Or did he say it with swagger? I'm going to get me a gun. The latter? Okay. And what did you hear? Did you hear what the news anchor said when they went back to the news desk? That is very scary indeed. And to me, the fact that you don't see the news anchor makes it even more powerful. It's like in a novel, the omnipotent narrator is telling you, this is how you should feel about what you just saw. Okay? So think about that for a minute and think about how that makes you feel about a couple of things. How does it make you feel about that side of town? Do you want to drive through a side of town where the 4-year-olds are packing? I don't. I will avoid that side of town. Thank you very much. But think about how it makes you feel about those people. Right? What's wrong with them? Is it in their DNA? This is a little boy. He just saw somebody get shot, and his response is, I want to get me a gun too. It goes into the back of your mind. Let me show you that same interview from a different perspective.
That's what I like to hear. You ain't scared of nothing. Damn. When you get older, you gonna stay away from all these guns?
No.
No?
No.
What do you want to do when you get older?
I'm gonna have me a gun.
You are? Why you want to do that? You know what happens when
I'm gonna be the police.
Okay, well then you can...
So what he was saying was, I'm going to have a gun because I'm going to be a police officer and protect my neighborhood from this kind of crime. But somebody at that news station made the call to clip and show you that edited version, which was shown to millions in the Chicagoland area. So think about the damage done there. And think about how your unconscious mind takes that in. Remember, it's pattern recognition. So black people loot, white people find, and young black men with caps on in college are stealing, and little black boys respond to a shooting by saying, I'm going to get me a gun. Replay those over and over again, and you have to ask yourself, is there, how do we escape growing up with these images and not all have this unconscious association of a black male face with danger. These things seem harmless enough, but your unconscious mind takes them in and trying to do you a favor recognizes patterns. So speaking of patterns, so I'm on Twitter, and I'll tell you now, my Twitter game is mean. So if you're on Twitter, look at my Twitter game, and we have some fun with that. So on Twitter, somebody posted this, outraged a few days ago. A female doctor was driving through Savannah, Georgia, and saw this billboard, and this is not in 1919, this is 2019. And that billboard, if you can't see it very well, maybe it doesn't reproduce so well, it's three males with caps and masks on, and it says, "All cardiothoracic surgeons look like this." Now, who knows what in the world they were trying to sell? What kind of campaign is this? Someone on Twitter said that when they drove a couple of miles down the road, there was another billboard with these same men, and their masks were off and they were smiling. So maybe the point was the surgeons at our hospital are smiling because we have good outcomes. I don't know, but it's a bizarre campaign. But I want you to think about, but just wonder. Just think about a little girl looking at that sign. Just think about a little boy of color looking at that sign. Better yet, let's say it a different way. Let's say a little boy is looking at the sign and a little girl is looking at the sign, and then after looking at the sign, they go and do their homework. Does one have a psychological boost, a psychological advantage over the other? These images are around us that can, although they can be helpful at times, they can clearly be
In Brown
harmful.
versus Board of Education.
I'm going to skip that one and give you some examples of what implicit bias can do. In the education world, this was an important study of our school teachers. School teachers took the black-white implicit association test in this study, and then they were shown photographs of black or white children whose mouths were either turned up in the same degree of a smile or turned down in the same degree of a frown or neutral. And they were shown a series of pictures, and they were asked, when do you see anger or hostility? And there were a group of these teachers who were more likely to see anger and hostility in a black child whose mouth was in the same position as a white child than they were to see anger in the white child. But not all the teachers, but the teachers who had this implicit white race preference were more likely to see anger in a black child. Now you think about that, and you might think that it might translate into punishments. There are some data in my home state that they're related. So in K through 12 public schools in the state of Ohio, the average for major disciplinary actions defined as expulsion or suspension is 23 actions per 100 students, all comers. For minority students, it's triple, 68 actions per 100 students. And you might think that if you're more likely to see anger in a black child's face, that you're more likely to respond in kind to punishment. And how does this affect how our children think about themselves as they grow up? Well, let's talk a little bit about gender bias. Let's talk a little bit more about that. This is an interesting experiment that I like talking about. This was a one-person experiment. This woman did this on her own. Author Catherine Nichols. She wrote a book. She knew it was the best thing she'd ever written. She'd already published several books. She was really proud of this one. And the way it works in the literary world is that the gatekeepers to the publishing houses are the literary agents. So you got a book you want published, you send a chapter or an excerpt to the literary agent. They either kill it on the spot or they give it to the publishing house. So she sent this to 50 literary agents, and then she said, let me sit back and wait on the bidding war, because I know this is a good one here. She only got 2 responses, and they were negative. They said things like, your main character isn't very plucky, is she? Very high quality, but unlikely that the entire book will maintain the same quality. Now let's dig into that critique a little bit. What this critic is saying is that this chapter is so good I don't believe that the whole book is going to be as good. So that's going to be a no for us. Now, does anybody understand that critique? Okay. Well, Catherine Nichols was very disappointed. She was crushed, but she was feisty. In fact, she was plucky, you might say. So what she did was she'd been reading about implicit gender bias. So guess what she did? She took that chapter and sent it to another 50 agents, but changed the name of the author to George. Same chapter. But now George is the author as opposed to Catherine. She got 17 responses, and they were all positive. Comments were clever, well-constructed, exciting, please send more. So she became an 8.5 times better writer by changing her name from Catherine to George.
Is that overt?
It is possible. In fact, a lot of thank you for the question. It's possible that a lot of things we talk about, it's hard to separate completely if this is unconscious bias or conscious. Likely, often there is a combination of the two. So I know there must be some women in the audience who are thinking to themselves right now, what about that grant I wrote? What about that manuscript I sent to be published? Did the fact that the name on it was Mary instead of Bill somehow impact the quality of the content? This is one of several studies that implies the answer to that question is yes. Well, we as medical professionals are not superhuman. We have the same implicit biases as do others. In fact, every bullet point here is showing you a study that shows that physicians, whether specialists or primary care physicians, medical students, pharmacy students, nursing students, we're human. We all have these implicit biases as well. And this is a very important study by Janice Sabin, who's not too far from here in Seattle. She and her group published this paper. So that website that I told you about, projectimplicit.org, millions upon millions of people have gone to that website to take an implicit bias test. It's anonymous, but they do ask you some demographic information about yourself. In addition to demographics, they ask your occupation. So what Janice Sabin and her colleagues did is they tapped into that database to look at the results specifically on the black-white implicit association test for those who said their occupation was physician versus everybody else. Here's what they found. First of all, 70% of non-physicians had implicit white race preference, which is, in my mind, unconsciously, a white face equals good and a black face equals bad. 70%. You want to know what proportion of physicians had that same preference? 70%. Here are some quotes from the study. Implicit preference for white Americans was strong among all MD groups except for African American MDs. White MDs showed the strongest implicit preference for whites, and this is, if you want to read today's New York Times article on this, they talk about this as well. So when you read this, and when I talk to other people about this, the first thing they think reflexively is, well, this is probably just, you're familiar with what you see a lot. This is just pattern recognition, and of course, white physicians have white preference, but probably Asian physicians have Asian preference, Hispanic physicians have Hispanic preference, but that's actually not what this study showed. White, Asian, and Hispanic physicians all had white preference and a negative bias towards blacks. The African American MDs, on average, didn't show any implicit preference. There were a group who had black preference, a group who had white preference, but the overall majority were neutral. So, physicians have implicit preference, they have implicit bias, but what you and I really want to know is does that translate into what we do every day in taking care of our patients? Maybe. And there's some strong evidence that it's yes or maybe. So you're looking at pictures of actors. This is an old study, but it's an oldie but goodie. In this study, it was done at the American College of Physicians annual meeting. So at this meeting, researchers walked around the lobby of the convention center asking who'd like to volunteer to be in the study. If you said yes, you went into a booth and you saw a film. The film you saw was of only one. You only saw one of these actors, but they all were reading an identical script, and they all read it the same way. These are trained actors. So they all complained of chest discomfort, which feels like a ton of bricks sitting on my chest. I couldn't breathe. My left arm was numb. I broke out in a drenching sweat, and I had this impending sense of doom. You don't have to be a cardiologist to know, sounds like this patient is threatening to have a heart attack. Well, you saw that film, and then you answered some questions. Embedded in the middle of the questions was, would you refer this patient for a cardiac catheterization? Which, as we all know, is a test we do to document that you have blocked coronary arteries, and if you have blocked arteries, we want to fix them before you have a heart attack. What they found is that the people that were most likely referred were the white males, even though they all had an identical history. Who was second, you think? Who was second most likely referred for a heart cath? White females, correct. Who was third? Black males, bringing up the rear were the black females. In other words, when she complained of a ton of bricks sitting on her chest, taking away her breath, radiating to her left arm, and a drenching sweat, she was much less likely to be referred for a heart cath than when he said it. And again, if you were to say that to these doctors ahead of time, are you aware that you treat your black and white patients differently, that you treat your male and female patients differently? You better put up your dukes and be ready for a fight, because that's not who they want to be, and that's not who they think they are. These are good people. I really believe doctors are humanitarians, but our unconscious biases can hijack our intentions. What they would probably say to you is, no, I don't. I use my clinical judgment. I use the history and the physical. They had the identical history. Their history was identical. What happens when we are interacting with somebody who is in a group against which we have an unconscious bias? We actually know it both from social psychology research and research in our sphere in the medical world. Each bullet point here is a study that all had remarkably similar results. These were studies in which physician-patient interaction in an office visit was recorded with the consent of the physician and the patient, and then graded by neutral observers. And what they found, and also they had these physicians take the implicit bias test before this research, what they found is that in a one-on-one interaction with patients, if you are interacting with a patient who's from a group against which you have an implicit bias, the communication style is one called verbal dominance, which means I'm doing all the talking. Not the way we teach our trainees and our students to have this participatory, what do you think? What are your questions? Are you understanding everything I'm saying? But more, this is how it is, this is how it's going to be. Next patient. Verbal dominance. I'm doing all the talking. From social psychology research, we learn more about how we interact with people who are from a group against we have an unconscious bias. We allow them less time to speak. We smile less eye contact, fewer impromptu social comments. How about that game last night? So think about this. Have you ever had an interaction with a patient and you came out of that interaction saying to yourself, you know, something just didn't feel right. You know, I went in there with my same humanitarian heart that I always do, but somehow we were missing each other, just didn't have a connection there. I don't know why. I just left feeling like it was a tense interaction. It is possible that that was an interaction with the patient who is in a group against which you are unconsciously biased. And it is possible that they felt it too. Well, let's go see the cancer doctor. Imagine what it's like when you're going to see your oncologist, how, as I like to say, you know, your heart is in your throat. I mean, that's a scary visit. Maybe your oncologist is going to tell you that the chemo isn't working. Maybe they're going to tell you that the CAT scan has seen some more spots. That's got to be a very anxiety-provoking visit. In this study, 18 oncologists took the black-white IAT, and then they went about their business seeing their patients, and over several weeks, between the 18 of them, they saw over 100 black patients. The office visit was recorded, videotaped, with the consent of the patient and the doctor, and graded by neutral observers. Here's what they found, 3 things. One, first of all, consistent with those other studies, they found that if the doctor had implicit white race preference on that test, their communication style with their black patients was verbal dominance. This is what you have. This is what we're going to do. See you next time. Interestingly, they also found, because they recorded the time of the visit, the doctors with implicit white race preference, their office visit with their black patients was shorter in duration. The final thing they found, which was fascinating, they had the patients fill out patient satisfaction surveys. It turns out there was an inverse relationship with the doctor's implicit white race preference and the satisfaction with that visit of the black patient.
Is it possible that the white doctors had overt racism that they were not willing to acknowledge?
It is. It is. On the implicit association test, it always asks you, what are your explicit preferences? So as I'll show you in a minute, on the black-white IAT, it asks you, do you prefer blacks? Do you prefer whites, or are you neutral? And it records that as your explicit preference, and then the test begins to see your implicit preference. And as you are suggesting, there is always a big split between the two, between what people are either aware of explicitly, or I think what you're implying, what they'll admit to, versus their implicit bias. Yes?
I'm wondering if when these, because you've mentioned a number of these studies have them take the IAT first, do they give them their results and say, like, FYI, before you go in and see these next 100 patients, you should know that you have this bias? Or do they just have them take the test but not give them the results that we would get if we just went to the computer and took the test?
That's an excellent question. I don't know. Actually, in this study, they don't say. They don't say. As you know, as you've said, when you take the test, you know, your results come up right away. So I don't know if they rigged it here so that they didn't see the results or not. Excellent question. Thank you. And this is just to show you, again, graphically, and this isn't even from the same study. This is from another study published in 2013. On this graph, you see the implicit racial bias of the doctors and the satisfaction of the black patients. So the stronger the implicit white race preference, the less satisfied on 4 different parameters: interpersonal treatment, communication, trust, and contextual knowledge. There was this inverse relationship. Oddly, with Hispanic patients, there didn't seem to be that relationship. So, communication. So we've talked about communication and how important that is, and how when we interact with somebody from a group against we have an unconscious bias, we may not have eye contact, we may not smile. It may be a tense interaction, whether or not we can feel it. But it seems like they can feel it. Here's an interesting study that might show us what is happening in the clinical setting. In this study, 33 hospital-based physicians, hospitalists, completed 2 encounters with prognostically similar terminally ill black and white patients. These patients were dying. This was the palliative care conversation. You know, that conversation where we say to our patients, we have tried. We've tried everything. You don't seem to be getting better. I don't think you would survive that surgery. I don't think you would survive the procedure. And you know what? It's time for us to think about just making you comfortable. Your family's here. Let's just make you comfortable. That conversation. So these doctors were having that conversation with terminally ill black patients and terminally ill white patients. The researchers came up with a point score system for verbal communication and nonverbal communication, and the results showed that the verbal communication scores didn't differ by race. That is gratifying. That means the doctors said the same thing to the white patients that they did to the black patients. But there was a significant difference in nonverbal communication. There's a point score system that was created a priori before the study, and here it is. You got a point for each one of these. Touch for non-diagnostic purposes, i.e. hand on the shoulder, hand on the back, holding the hand. One of the best compliments I ever got from one of my staff members, whose father I took care of before he passed, was she said, Dr. Capers, you had me when you were talking to him about the procedure and you were holding his hand the whole time you were talking to him. I didn't even notice that I do that, but often I'll shake the patient's hand and then I'll cradle their hand in mind when I'm talking to them. So touch for non-diagnostic purpose, you got a point. Open body position, which translates into facing the patient. Proximity, standing closer to the patient. And finally, eye contact. That was happening less when the whites talked to the black patients than when they talked to the white patients. So let me ask you some questions. Please respond with a yes or no. Now, you know, I hope this isn't the first time you've considered this, but if you and I are lucky enough and we're blessed enough, one day our doctors are going to be having this conversation with us. So when that day comes for you, when your doctor has to tell you it's time to think about comfort and not cure because you're at the end of the road, please answer yes or no. Would you like your doctor in that conversation to be holding your hand? A few yeses, not very many yeses, but a few. Would you like your doctor to be facing you? Would you like your doctor to be standing close to you? Would you like your doctor to be looking you in the eye?
Absolutely.
This suggests that if you are white and your doctor is white, you got no worries. That's probably going to happen. Now again, these are good people. Doctors are humanitarians, but our unconscious bias can hijack our good intentions. I'm going to make a shift here to my other interest, if you don't mind, medical school admissions. What do we know? We know that physicians have the same levels of implicit bias as non-physicians. Who is on medical school admissions committees? Us. Yes, we have other people on admissions committees. We have medical students, and we have PhD medical school faculty members. But it seemed that if implicit white preference was present on admissions committees, it could put our minority candidates at a disadvantage. Little was known about this, and so we decided to study it in 2012. And we had all 140 members. We got a big admissions committee at Ohio State, 140 people. We had all of them take 3 IATs, the black-white, the sexuality IAT, and there's a very interesting one that looks to see if unconsciously you prefer the image of the man at work and the woman as a homemaker, and have an aversion for the opposite, for the man at work. And I'm going to show you some interesting pictures. So let me set this up for you. This was prior to the 2012-2013 cycle. So we all took the test. It wasn't optional. If you were going to participate on the admissions committee that year, you were going to take this test. What we got back, you were the only one who saw your individual results, but we got back the aggregate results, which we presented to the committee at our annual admissions committee treat prior to the 2012-2013 cycle. Then at the end of that cycle, we then surveyed the committee to see what were their thoughts on that exercise and whether or not it had any impact. Well, here's one of the tests we had them take. So this one I want to show you, it's interesting. This male career stereotype is designed to see what is your unconscious association or unconscious preference with regards to a man or a woman in a professional setting at work, or a man and a woman as a homemaker. So these are some pictures that aren't necessarily on this test. They have been used on a test before. But just look at these, and even though they might make you feel a certain way consciously, it's interesting to think about, and we talk about this a lot in my unconscious bias workshops, which of these does your unconscious mind prefer? So, for example, someone with the unconscious male career stereotype prefers these images, 1, 2, 3, the man with the suit and briefcase about to take on the world, and the women as homemakers. And they have an aversion for the woman in the boardroom about to make some important decisions, and the guys at home. So here are the results of the OSU College of Medicine Admissions Committee. The height of the bars are the proportion of the people in that group who have the male career stereotype bias. We have medical students, faculty, men, and women. And yes, we're still scratching our head about this. Every single woman, whether or not she was a 20-something-year-old medical student or a faculty member, unconsciously preferred man at work, woman at home. Not just to pick on the women, 50% or more of the entire committee. So what does it mean when the committee has an easier time? This is another way to say this bias. That means that when I look at a woman, I have an easier time picturing her as a homemaker than picturing her as a professional at work. So what might that mean? What might it mean if the person with the bias is in charge of who gets hired and fired, who gets promoted, who gets into medical school, dental school, law school, who gets the judgeship, who becomes chief of the division, who gets the grant, et cetera. I'm going to skip these slides here, but I want to make this case. You've seen this kind of data before. This data is from New York State, 2011, where newly minted physicians just arriving to the state got a survey that simply asked about their starting salary. And you see an average salary gap of $17,000 in favor of men. If you think that is sobering, and that's for 28 of 30 specialties, that was the case. If you think that's sobering, the same researchers have updated this for 2017. They named this study the $16,819 pay gap for newly trained physicians. If they were to use the same cutesy way of naming the current study, it would be called the $27,000 pay gap for newly trained physicians. So it has gotten worse. So here's what we worry about in admissions, that this young lady is applying for medical school, she's interviewing, and the fair-minded faculty member consciously says, I'm a fair person, and I'm going to look at the objective measures, I'm going to look at her experiences, references, her essay, and her academic record. But if in his unconscious mind, he looks at her and sees homemaker, does he grade her essay the same way? Does he grade her interview answers the same way? Does he look at her list of experiences and give them the same value? Fair-minded people. We also had them take the black-white implicit association test, which actually starts with this question. What best describes you? I prefer white Americans to black Americans. I like whites and blacks equally, or I prefer black Americans to white Americans. It records your answer as your explicit preference, and then you take the test. These are the results of the OSU College of Medicine Admissions Committee, and this graph shows you the percentage with implicit white race preference. The first two bars are the women. Now the 10%, that's explicit white preference. That means 10% of the women on the admissions committee admitted, yes, I prefer white Americans to black Americans. But 52% had this unconscious white race preference. The men, 10% of the men confessed. Now, maybe it was more, but 10% would admit that I prefer white Americans to black Americans, but 64% had this unconscious white race preference. And I'll tell you this, so we've got medical students and faculty. I was trying to sequester these results, so we'd have a big splash at the admissions committee orientation. I don't want the results to get out. Somehow, as these things do, it got out. And I remember a medical student came up to me and said, Dr. Capers, I heard about those results. We grew up in a different time, we millennials. You're not going to find the same thing with us as you do with those old folks. I said, okay, I'll see you at the retreat. Medical students versus faculty. So these are the 20-somethings. These are the millennials. 10% had explicit white race preference. 52% had unconscious white race preference. And here we have the faculty. The highest of all were the faculty, 69% with this implicit white race preference. We actually found important differences by group. Here you're looking at the magnitude of the implicit white race preference. Even though women have it, they have less than half the magnitude of the men. And even though the medical students have it, they have less than half the magnitude of the faculty. We actually take this into account when populating the admissions committee and think it should be taken into account when populating any committee that's making important decisions. This isn't the first time it's been shown that women have less. They have less implicit racial bias than men. They just do. And so if you've got a committee that's making important decisions like setting salaries and you want there to be less racial bias, you want that committee to be heavy on women. And you want to have a mix of younger persons and more senior persons. Because here's what we're concerned is happening. This young man is applying to medical school, he's interviewing, and the interviewer, who is a fair person, says, I'm going to look at the objective measures, experiences, references, etc. But if that faculty member, unbeknownst to him even, in his mind, unconsciously associates a black face with danger, violence, misery, fear, noncompliance, is he grading the essay the same way? Is he grading the conversation the same way? We're concerned about that, especially when we think about these things. Remember, you smile less, you allow them less time to speak and less visual contact. Imagine that being your medical school interview. Imagine your interviewer not smiling at you, no eye contact, and cutting you off when you try to speak. Are you going to leave that interaction wanting to go to that medical school? Well, we'd answered one question: is implicit bias present in medical school admissions? The answer was yes. We had two other questions. How do committee members feel about their individual results? Number two was the big so what. When I was a research fellow at Emory, I'd be toiling away in the laboratory and I'd find a finding and I'd show it to my PI, and he would break my heart every time when he would say, so what? So I'd be so excited. I'd say, look, I sprayed this into the culture and the cells behaved differently. He said, so what? And I hated it then, but what he was trying to get me to do was think about the broader implications. So this is the so what. Will this have a measurable impact? So at the end of that next cycle, remember we surveyed the committee. 71% completed the survey where we asked some questions that were open-ended and some that were pointed questions. 67% agreed with this. Taking the IAT will reduce bias in admissions. 48%, almost half, said I was conscious of my individual IAT results when interviewing candidates in the next cycle. So in other words, when I'm sitting down in that one-on-one interview, I'm remembering the results I got on that test that Dr. Capers made us take. 21%, 1 in 5, said knowledge of my IAT results impacted my admissions decisions in the subsequent cycle. We had an open-ended question where we said, tell us whatever you want to about this exercise. We want to hear from you, and I'll share some of those with you. I don't believe the results of this test. There are lots of older faculty on the committee that I assume would have these old-fashioned opinions. I'm going to guess that was a medical student or maybe a junior faculty member. I am insulted by this test. It states that I have a bias against blacks, women, and homosexuals. I have many colleagues that fit these descriptions that I'm very close to. I myself am a brown person. Rubbish. My IAT said I prefer blacks over whites, yet I feel it would be inappropriate for me to try to compensate for that. Looking at pictures and clicking buttons does not equal how one interacts with a human being. I'm not convinced of any validity of this test. So clearly, we didn't change everybody's mind. It's more likely that it creates bias and that it implicitly encourages admission of minority candidates rather than focusing on the content of their character. Actually, we got several like this, and it was interesting because it was as if they took away from this that what we were after was to make you all feel guilty so that when you are interviewing a minority candidate who is not qualified, that you'll say, but I'm going to give them the thumbs up anyway. Which, of course, is not what we were after, but we did want to point out that even the most qualified minority candidate might be at a disadvantage if, when we see this, a black face, we automatically associate it with bad things. So what happened? At the end of this, we then looked at our data, and what I've shared with you is what some might consider the unfortunate side of this research. Let me tell you about the fortunate side. The next class that we admitted, the next class that matriculated, was the most diverse in the history of The Ohio State University College of Medicine. Because we not only talked about our results, but we had a session on how to reduce implicit bias, or at least the impact of implicit bias. Let me tell you what we thought happened. So what we thought happened was, okay, we went through this exercise, and we went out and we accepted more minority candidates. When we looked at the data, that's actually not what happened. So this is the cycle immediately prior and immediately after. We had more underrepresented minority applicants, but we're always recruiting for more applicants, but the proportion interviewed stayed about the same. Those offered acceptance only went up by one. But when you looked at new enrollees, there was a big difference, an absolute difference of 10%, a relative difference of 21% that accounted for our increase in underrepresented minorities in the class from 17% to 20%. So in other words, it's not that after implicit bias training, we went out and accepted more minority candidates, but after implicit bias training, more of the minority candidates that we accepted us and decided to come to Ohio State. This implies that being trained in implicit bias reduction techniques allows us to interact differently with people that might allow those people to sense a more inclusive climate and actually want to matriculate at our medical school. So that is our hypothesis. There are other explanations, but we've continued now every year implicit bias a workshop is a part of our admissions committee retreat, and our diversity has continued to go up. So we published this, and it's gotten a lot of attention. There was in academic medicine a couple of years ago, and I'll never forget that the comments we got back from the reviewers was, hey, wait a minute now. We've got to be careful. This is just one medical school. This does not mean that this is happening at other medical schools. It's implicit bias. And so what I wanted to say, but I didn't, in my comments back to the reviewer, I said, yeah, but, we all know how, as Ohio goes, so goes the nation, right? I mean, in the Electoral College, and the, Columbus, Ohio is a test market USA. When McDonald's wants to introduce the McRib sandwich again for the 13th time, they start in Columbus because they think this is a slice of Americana. But of course I didn't. I said, thank you very much for your comments. So here's the good news. We can overcome our implicit biases. These are 4 research-proven strategies to do so. One is common identity formation. Taking advantage of the fact that we all belong to certain groups, and by this I don't mean race and gender. By this I mean groups like middle child, first girl in the family, grew up on a farm. It turns out if you're in that group, you automatically have a bond with others who are in that group. And taking advantage of that and simply being made aware of that reduces your implicit bias. So example, let's say I've taken a test that says I have a bias against people who wear traditional Muslim clothes. There is such a test. And now I'm going to interview a young lady for medical school who's wearing the hijab. Well, I don't want my unconscious bias to put her at a disadvantage, so what can I do? What I can do is, in the interview, keep probing until I find what common group I am in that she is also in. So I'm a big LeBron James fan. The moment I find out that she also is a big LeBron James fan, that actually inhibits the neural pathways that activate the unconscious bias. If I grew up on a farm and I've milked a cow from experience, and I find out that she knows how to milk a cow from experience, that reduces my unconscious bias against her. Research proves this is the case. Number 2, perspective taking. Take the perspective of a member of the group against which you have the unconscious bias. And by this we mean really try to get into that person's head. So let's say I've taken a test that shows, there's a test you can take that looks to see if when you see a male, academically, you associate a male with science competence, and you associate females with competence in the arts, the humanities. Well, I'm a medical school admissions dean, so science competence is important to me. So let's say I have that bias, and now I'm going to interview a young lady. I don't want that bias to put her at a disadvantage. What can I do? I can try to take her perspective. What did she go through today to get to me, to this interview? What did she go through last week, 6 months ago, 10 years ago? What was it like being a little girl when there was this nonsense about girls don't do math and science well? She overcame that. What was it like being in college where the science professors are more likely to take a young man under their wing and mentor than a young lady? She overcame that. And if she's well-read, as you all are, she knows that she's going to graduate from medical school with on average $180,000 worth of student loan debt. But when she takes a job, at least in the state of New York, she's going to get paid less than a man for doing the same thing. So if I contemplate all of that, I build empathy for her, and that's the key. Empathy actively opposes unconscious bias. It's that simple. Number 3, consider the opposite. When you have information pointing to one conclusion, time out. Don't make a decision just yet. Force yourself to go through this exercise where you go back through the data, looking for evidence for the opposite conclusion, and then make a decision. Example, let's say I'm looking at a file and I say, I don't think this student is going to be able to cut it academically. And I think that because they got a D in chemistry. Before I make a decision, let me go back through that file one more time, page by page, looking for evidence for the opposite conclusion, that they will do well academically. Maybe I'm going to reread that letter recommendation from the research PI, looking for good critical thinking. Maybe I'm going to look for things that they overcame, uncommon resilience and persistence, that will lead me to the conclusion that, well, you know, this person just might be able to make it in medical school. Now I make a decision. That blunts the impact of our unconscious bias. And then finally, counter stereotypical exemplars. Spend time with or focus on individuals you admire from groups against which you have a bias. You can do this remotely. So take a test, and if it shows you have a bias against group X, there's somebody on planet Earth from group X that you admire. Now, they might be a celebrity, might be somebody you don't have access to, maybe an athlete or an entertainer. But for instance, reading their memoirs, reading their autobiography, reading about them can actually reduce your unconscious bias against that group. But that's remote. I like to do it more upfront and personal. Spending time with people who are different like you, forcing yourself to do so, can reduce your unconscious bias. If you think about what we've all been doing since grade school, in the cafeteria, when you get your food on your tray and you look out at that sea of tables, who are you looking for? You're looking for people who are just like you. Force yourself to spend time with people who have a different religion, different sexuality, different gender, different race. If you're a Democrat, sit with some Republicans. If you're a Republican, sit with some Democrats. You will find traits that you admire, and if you force yourself to keep at it, your unconscious bias against those groups will go down. I'm sorry I've gone over, but if you give me 30 more seconds, I want to show you something really important. At the end of our unconscious bias workshops, we ask everybody to look at these strategies and make a pledge. Make a pledge to use one of these strategies in some upcoming interaction. I want to share you some pledges from physicians, both at The Ohio State University and around the country where I've put on this workshop. I'll be working the night shift this weekend in the emergency department. When a patient comes in at 2 a.m. for a laceration, instead of assuming they were up to no good, I will consider the opposite. Since my team is very diverse, I've been confronted with and had to deal with getting used to working with a large number of Muslims. I'm not used to or comfortable with their culture because of all the bad news around the world. So I think using this common identity formation will help in this area. I'm fine at work, but you know, in my neighborhood, I have a harder time with black single males when I'm out walking. I'm going to try to assume positive intent and say hello and not assume they may accost me. I will think of positive exemplars I know that are black males. And then finally, on my next shift, I will most definitely see a patient dressed like a thug. I will take the perspective of the patient and try to imagine their life and background. This is work that we have to put in every day, but I know that you agree with me that it is worth it. Thank you very much for your attention. Oh, hello, yes. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Two questions. One related to your talk and one not related to your talk, I think. Medical school classes in recent years have been virtually 50-50 male female. 25 years ago, different story. And the second question, the use of the word black versus the use of the word African American.
Yes, so let me start with your second question first. So I like both terms, black and African American. If we really talk about what the term means, black is the umbrella term, and African American is blacks who live in America. So the way I talk about it with my children is that Michael Jordan is black, and he's an African American. Nelson Mandela was black, but not an African American. I like both terms. There are some people that prefer one or the other. And the first statement is you're right. Women are now, and have been actually for some time, half of the applicant pool, but it's only been in recent years that we've achieved actually slightly more women than men in medical school classes. But even though women are more than half the applicant pool, there still are probably half of the medical schools in this country where there are more women than men being accepted every year. We found that gender bias is also present, at least on our admissions committee at The Ohio State University. And gender bias meaning not anti-woman, but woman unconsciously means homemaker, and man means professional. Yes?
Is it possible that it is a gray zone between unconscious bias and unadmitted conscious bias?
Well, yes. And that's a great question. So, again, as I showed you, the way these tests are structured is that first it asks you, what is your conscious bias? And then it takes, then you do the test. There's always a difference. There's always a difference, which always begs the question, is it that people's expressed conscious bias is really that low? Or is it just that we're aware of what's socially acceptable and we just won't admit it, even though it's an anonymous test? So I'm not sure how we will be able to get at that other than hypnotizing people and giving them truth serum. But yeah, that certainly is a possibility.
How
Yeah.
common do you think unadmitted conscious bias is?
That's a good question. I suspect it's common. I suspect we live in a time where now things might be changing, but I suspect we live in a time where it is not popular, for instance, to admit that you have a gender or sexuality or racial bias. Yes.
So my reference is to Thomas Sowell, who I'm sure you've heard of. He's a Stanford professor, African American, talking upon something that you don't have here, which is comparing blacks with, in other words, put Mexican Americans in where white is, okay, and see what reverse bias occurs. And his reverse bias is, with regard to the Rainbow Coalition, that it would never work because when there are two people coming up for a job, according to Thomas Sowell is black, the Mexican American will get the job every time. Because there is this huge bias against blacks in the working group of people, and he explained exactly what that was, which I thought was very fancy, really fantastic coming from an African American mind. So here, what I see you have is, white bias, but what about black bias that's implicit that may have something to do with how the interaction occurs?
Again, we all have biases. In fact, just about every time I do an implicit bias workshop at an institution other than mine, afterwards there's a line of people to talk to me, and there's always an African American in the back who's waiting until everyone has left the room. And because he specifically chooses to get last in line, I know what he's going to say, because it happens every time. He pulls me aside and says, I took that test and I have implicit white race preference. I mean, they're embarrassed to admit that. But if you think about the images that I showed you, how can we not be? If you grow up and these are the images that bombard us. So we all have bias.
Let me say one other thing. When I was an intern at San Francisco General Hospital, the chief resident came up to me and said, the Black Panthers want you to be the go-to guy.
Oh, really?
I don't know, I think it's curly hair. But anyway, bottom line is, I was that person. Then I went into service, went to Libya. I was asked to be a football coach. I was a line coach. All the guys in the line were African American. They wanted to know if I would be a member of their black, secret group.
Yeah.
And
So
they went back to the ones who never saw me, didn't know me, one another, and guess what? I'm white. I can't be in. So
fascinating.
there's
Fascinating.
very significant racial bias. I went into a barber shop on Nicollet Avenue to get a haircut. It was a black place, and they took me in and cut my hair, and then I had a conversation with him, and I went down and talked to the black police officers at the Nicollet Library about this place because they're very isolated, and they said, we talk with them all the time. Let white people come in and cut their hair. Maybe you'll be part of this society.
So I want to be, sorry.
Thank you.
Respectful.
Oh, yes. Would they be able to come down and talk to me? Yep. Okay. Sorry for going over. Thank you all so much.